roughly 40 minutes presentation, followed by a Q&A from the audience, and ending with a feedback and discussion section with Carl. And I see that we are recording. Thank you very much, Carl. So today I'm delighted to introduce Robert Worden. Robert was trained as a physicist and has been a visiting researcher at TNB. He's currently a fellow at the Active Inference Institute. So without further ado, I shall pass it on to you, Robert. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Okay. Can people hear me clearly?
Yes.
Right. Well, I'll start. So this is a talk about computers, meaning, and consciousness. And it's really the purpose of the talk is to convey a couple of negative results to you. And the first negative result is about computers in general, either man-made computers or brains. And it says the information actually inside a computer doesn't define what computation it's doing, what the computation is about, the external meaning of the computation. So that's a general result for all computers. If you translate this to brains seen as neural computers, the result is if the brain is only a computer, and that only is important, then it's not capable of being conscious of external things. So the whole business of the talk is negative results. And I believe negative results are important for the following reason. They can have very far-reaching implications. If you take something like the conservation of energy, which is a negative result, you can't make energy out of nothing. So you get results about no perpetual motion machines, all sorts of other results. Or the second law of thermodynamics, where there are no for-free heat engines. Or a more recent one is Gödel's incompleteness theorems, and they say that if you start doing purely axiomatic maths, you run into a brick wall. You can't prove it's consistent. So what negative results do is they kind of clear the ground and they make room for new ideas. And that's why I hope to convince you that this negative result is an important one, because it's like an incompleteness theorem for computers. And I think it has far-reaching implications, but we'll see what you think about that as we go through. So to explain, first outline explanation of the results. The first part is that computation is not just a physical process. I think a lot of people have regarded it as simply a physical process, but it's not that. It is an external interpretation of a physical process, and there has to be an external interpreter to understand it. Another way of approaching this is any information inside a running computer is physically encoded. It has to be physically encoded to support whatever the computation is. And so without decoding that information, the physical events inside the computer don't have meaning. They're not about external things. Now, this part of the talk is not new. It goes back to some results by Horstman et al. Around 2014, which has been, they started on man-made computers, and Stepney more recently, including this paper by Stepney and Kendon, they generalize it to brains, biological computers. And so the implications of that, which I'm going to draw, are that are in the last 4 bullet points. The first one of these is that consciousness, as we know, has meaning. It's about external things, like we're conscious of the space around us and the things in that space. But if the brain is just a computer without any decoding, the computations in the brain have no meaning. So they can't have meaning about external things. Now, if you're going to decode information in the brain, that requires decoding information, which I shall argue doesn't exist inside the brain. Decoding information is outside the brain. So if you have a brain model of the brain that's purely a neuron computer, you can't get consciousness out of it. Consciousness does not arise from neural computing in the brain. So that's an outline of what the results are about. If I will proceed towards it through some examples, hopefully as intuition pumps to help make the results more plausible, I shall move from books to computers to brains, 3 kinds of devices. In all 3 of these devices, the information is physically encoded. And without decoding, the information doesn't have meaning. And the decoding is always done outside the device. So the device itself cannot be conscious. And so this may be pretty obvious for books. And the question is, why is it different? Why is it not obvious for computers and brains? So that's what we're going to be looking at. So meaning in books, physically what you have in a book is a bunch of squiggles on the paper, but you do a lot of decoding, you interpret it. And the interpretations you make are, you interpret the shapes of ink as letters, you interpret strings of letters as words, strings of words as sentences, and sentences as meanings, and finally meanings as stories, or whatever they may be, lists or. And so there's a lot of interpretation that goes on before you get meaning out of a book. And by the way, in this talk, I shall be using the word interpret more or less interchangeably with the word decode. So you can try that out for yourself if you like. Whenever I say interpret, try out the word decode for size. So that's books. Now we move on to man-made computers. Physically, what's going on inside the box is just digital electronics, nothing else. But we interpret that digital electronics, we interpret voltages as bits, we interpret bit strings as numbers in various complicated ways. We may interpret those numbers as solutions of algebraic equations, and we may interpret that algebra as a model of a physical thing. And the FEP is a good example of that. There are lots of computer implementations. We interpret the numbers that come out of those implementations as solutions to the FEP equations, and we interpret the FEP equations as models of brains. So that's digital computers. Again, a lot of interpretation going on, a lot of decoding. Finally, brains. Physically, what's happening is neurons are firing, and we interpret that. We interpret neuron spike trains as sense data coming into the brain. We also, in Bayesian computer models, interpret the spike trains as probabilities of things and events in the world. We also interpret the spike trains as parameters of things. They measure the size or the position of something. And we interpret synaptic connection strength in the brain as learning and memory. And finally, on the way out, neural spike trains are interpreted as motor commands to muscles. So to summarize interpretation or decoding in these three kinds of devices, in all three kinds of device, there is a chain of interpretation. You interpret A as B, B as C, and so on. And there are many links in the chain, but at each link, there are many choices. There's no one obvious choice. It's not obvious what voltage stands for 1 and what voltage stands for 0 and so on. There's a huge number of choices and a huge number of end-to-end interpretation. Now, to get the right interpretation, you need decoding information. You need information to tell you how it's decoded. And there's an infinite number of wrong interpretations if you don't have that information. But the important thing is all that decoding information resides outside the device. And so there's no meaning intrinsically inside the device. And so I shall argue that the device itself cannot be conscious if it's only a computer. If all the information in it is encoded and there's no decoding, you can't get consciousness out of it. So that's how you take this progression from books to computers to brains. And 3 examples now. First example, a floor cleaning robot, a Roomba. Initially, if you've seen any of these devices, they blunder around the room, bumping into things, but they're programmed to have a digital map of the room inside them. So after a while, the Roomba doesn't bump to the table and so on. But the map in the Roomba's computer is encoded information. It's in the memory. And decoding happens outside the computer. Decoding happens in the head of the designer, who may have to fix the machine, or it happens in the motor and the steering, which help us to actually avoid obstacles. So there's no information inside the computer which defines which memory locations refer to some particular object, like a table leg. So the computer itself can't look at these locations to be consciously aware of A. And this illustrates the general point, which I put in bold, that physical events inside the computer don't define what it's computing. And in fact, a theme here is that when we talk about computers, we always use person-centered metaphors. Even the word computing is a metaphor, or memory, or processing, and so on. And those are what tends to mislead us to think there's more going on inside the box than there actually is. So that's first example. I shall now get simpler. Another simpler kind of computer is an abacus. Now, what happens inside an abacus, you can see one there, is not addition. It's just like beads sliding along wires. But we've designed the abacus so we can interpret it as adding. Now, we could interpret the abacus in many ways. We could interpret it as a model of sheep in a meadow, or as a model of fish on the moon, or we could as a fortune-telling device, or we could interpret it as a multiplying device. I'll just dwell on this last one. If you imagine these red beads are zeros in the representation of a number, which is 1 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 and so on, then sliding a bead along multiplies a number by 10. So you could equally well interpret the abacus as a multiplying device, just as well as thinking of it as an adding device. It happens to be more useful than an adding device. That's how we use it. Because the abacus could be any one of those things, intrinsically it's not any one of them. And again, physical events inside the abacus
Sorry, Robert. Sorry, something happened. And you were muted for some reason.
Turned his mic off.
Yeah, I think you just need to unmute yourself. Sorry, something. It should be in the top right corner. There should be a mic, and if you just click on that. And
There you go.
Right, I don't know why it muted. Can you tell me where I need to go back to?
Now you need to go back to share screen.
No, I'm still sharing. Am I still sharing the screen?
You are still sharing, and you need to go back into full screen if you want to.
Yeah, but what slide do I have to go back to?
The abacus slide.
The abacus, right.
And you just started talking about imagining the red beads to be ones and
so
zeros.
Only on that slide, right? I will start again from there. I apologize for that. I don't know why on earth it muted itself, but it did. My wife comes down and tells me when it mutes itself. Right. So we've done the floor cleaning robot. We're doing the abacus. And what I'm saying is what happens I'll start the abacus again. What happens inside an abacus is not addition. It's purely beads sliding along on wires. Now, we've designed the abacus so we can interpret it as addition. We could interpret it in many other ways, for instance, as a model of sheep in a meadow, or a fortune-telling device, or a multiplying device. Now, what I was explaining was that how we look at it as a multiplying device, if you imagine those red beads as zeros in a representation of a number, 1 or 10 or 1,000 or 10,000, then every time you move a bead along, you're multiplying the result by 10. So you could, if you wanted, interpret the abacus as a multiplying device. So this illustrates again the point that physical events inside the abacus don't define what it's computing. And in this case, people are the representational entities who interpret the abacus as an adding machine. Right, so an even simpler example next. Any clock. You can regard a clock as a computer which simply computes the time. And there are many kinds of clock. There are electronic clocks, mechanical clocks, sundials, or candles. And I'll just talk about candles. So you just watch a candle. As it goes down, you see the time passing, and you may think this candle's going to last 1 hour. But a burning candle is the computation process in this case, and the amount of wax left is an encoding of the time. So again, illustrates the representation of time inside the candle is encoded in the amount of wax, and we have to do the decoding. So this idea has some consequences for computers and artificial intelligence, which I won't dwell on very long. But if there is no decoding inside the computer, there are two big consequences. Firstly, we are not living inside a simulation. Now, that has been a fashionable speculation of people like Nick Bostrom and David Chambers, who've written long books about it. And they say there's no way you can prove that we're not inside a simulation. Now, I believe information inside a computer running a simulation is encoded information. So the simulated things, like people or whatever they may be, only exist in other people's interpretations or decoding of the outputs. And inside the computer itself, there are no simulated people. So we could not be simulated people inside a computer. A second practically important consequence is that people talk today about AI superintelligence, which is going to far exceed human intelligence, but it doesn't, the idea doesn't make sense, because inside an AI computer, there is only digital electronics, there are only bits. All the intelligence is encoded information. So it's people that decode it. All the intelligence in AI lies in human interpretation of the outputs. To put this in an example, Deep Blue was one of the early AIs that played chess, and it played very good chess. The reason it played great chess was because Garry Kasparov thinks it played great chess. So if AI superintelligence, AI computer comes out with some result that is so superhumanly intelligent, no person can understand it, it's not electronic intelligence, it's simply electronics going on. So I think those are two practically important results, but they're not the main focus of this talk. I said earlier that this result about computation is not original. It goes back to Horstman et al. In 2014. They showed that computation is an interpretation of a physical process by something external, which they call the representational entity, or I'll call the RE. So the RE is a thing that encodes the inputs and decodes the outputs. All the decoding information, the way of getting decoded information out, all that information needed to decode resides inside the RE and outside the computer. Now, they've more recently extended this from man-made computers to artificial computers to biological computers, and that's a paper by Stepney and Kennan in 2020. And in this case, the representational entity is also outside the brain. It's the animal's body. The sense organs encode the information to go into the brain, and the motor actions decode the information on the way out of the brain. And yet again, the physical events inside the computer brain don't define what it's computing. So now we come on to consider what's the impact for theories of consciousness. And we take three different statements, innocent-looking statements. One is that consciousness is caused by events in the brain. Two is that consciousness has meaning about external things. And three is the brain is a neural computer and only a neural computer. Now, one is an experimental fact because damage to the brain interrupts consciousness. Two is a very familiar fact of our experience. Your consciousness at this moment is of things around you, which external things, your computer screen and so on. And three is a very common hypothesis in theories of consciousness. Now, the three statements as they stand are not consistent, so one of them must be wrong. The reason is if the brain is only a computer, all the information inside it is encoded and has no defined meaning. So without decoding, which requires external information, it can't be conscious of things. So the conclusion is that the point 3 cannot be correct. Brain is not only a neural computer. We know it is a neural computer, but there must be something else going on inside it. And for the rest of this part of the rest of this talk, I'll talk about what that something else might be. Now, computational functionalism is a philosophical position, which is, you can state it by performing computations of the right kind is necessary and sufficient for consciousness. And it's been called a mainstream, although a disputed position in philosophy of mind. David Chalmers has written about it, calling it computational sufficiency. And the implication of what we just seen is that it's wrong. Now, why that matters is that most theories of consciousness assume computational functionalism. They start with the modeling of the brain as purely a computer, and then they try and produce a theory of consciousness. And so the implication of the results so far is that those theories of consciousness cannot be right. And I'll illustrate this in some examples. So most theories of consciousness assume that consciousness is caused by events in the brain. The brain is a neural computer, and inside the computer, certain computational processes, which I'll call P1 and P2 and so on, take place. And that some of these processes are the special things that cause consciousness. And we can take several current theories of consciousness. For instance, you might think P1, this process is representing things in the visual field, and that's what causes consciousness. Or you might think P2 is building Bayesian models of probabilities in reality. Or you might think P3 is higher order computation, reflecting about the brain's own computation. Or you might think it's making information globally available, as in global workspace theories. Or you might think it's P6 linking computation together with high connectivity, high phi factor, and that is, of course, the IGT theory of consciousness. Or you might think P7 is predictive coding. So all of these theories say there's some computational processes happening inside the brain, and therefore they cause consciousness. But the problem is that processes P1, P2, and 3, and so on, don't happen inside brains. They only happen in our interpretation of brains, of the events in the brain. And so without that interpretation, the processes in the brain could be a completely different set of processes, which I call Q1, Q2, and so on. So the implication of that reasoning is that most of these theories of consciousness cannot work because they have encoding, but they don't have decoding. Now, this is just a bit of a repeat of the previous slide. I think I'll skip over it. It's just going to a little more depth in why computational processes, you can have a process like P4, you can have a P4B, which is about P4 going on about some object B. And so it's just working around that. I think I'll move on from that. So what I'd like to do now, it's a bit against the standard format of a TNB seminar. I'd like to break now and have because I'm about 2/3 of the way through the talk, I'd like to break now if anybody wants to put in any suggestions or discussion of the results so far, and in particular, the result that computational functionalism is wrong and all those consciousness theories are wrong. Now, that result, I got to it by about 6 stages listed here. Physical events in the brain, consciousness containing information about the external world, and it's not encoded, and information in the brain is encoded, and you need to decode it, but you need extra decoding information to do that. And by the way, encoding can be regarded sometimes as encryption, and you can regard the decoding information as the kind of encryption key that you need to decrypt a message. And that sometimes makes the idea of encoding and decoding more vivid and shows really how you need the decryption key to get any information out. So the information required for decoding, the encryption key, is not inside the brain. And so you end up with the question, where does it come from? I don't think there's any good place you can make it come from. So that is roughly a 6-point summary of the argument so far. So if you want to disagree with the result, if you want to say that computational functionalism is correct, you have to get off the train or disagree with one of these 6 points. And I just wonder if anybody would like to come in and say, do they believe that computational functionalism is right? And if so, where would they like to, which of these 6 points would they like to disagree with? So I'll pause there for any discussion.
Alessandra, yes, please.
You're valid.
Hi, Robert. Thank you. This was
Hi.
very interesting. I am actually thinking something along similar lines, but I do have a response to your question right now. So I think one issue that is an issue for the step, but I agree with your overall argument, if that makes sense. So I think number 3, all information in the brain is encoded in patterns of neural firing.
Right.
So, I mean, we have local field potentials as well and oscillations that are.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. They get a little more borderline. They might be unencoded information, or they might be encoded.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess what I've been thinking is that the search for decoding is sort of, it's unclear whether they are code, because they are continuous patterns that you would need sort of a renormalization group to unpack or anything. So I've just been kind of thinking that that's it, basically.
Okay, well, that's a very interesting question because it's sort of anticipating where I'm going on the rest of the talk.
Amazing.
Do we have any more points for now?
Perhaps Carl would like to save his any questions to the end of the talk.
Yes, that's what I do. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Then I think we can continue for now, but I'm sure there will be, unless someone still has a question, but I'm sure there will be more questions or comments arising after the next section.
Okay, I'll bash on. So you got full screen again. Here is the positive proposal that the brain is a neural computer. We all know that, but it's not only that. So something else is going on inside the brain, has to be, because we know there's consciousness. So we need something else. And the question is, what can that something be? And my suggested answer is that the something else that's in the brain is an analog model of spatial reality. So a little bit about analog models. An analog model is some examples: a toy car or a map or a picture or an image in a lens. Now, what I say these things have in common is there's some kind of mapping between the model and the thing. In other words, a bit of a point-to-point mapping. The model has the same topology as P, as the physical situation it represents. And the function that connects them, the mapping that connects them, is a continuous function like a fiber bundle, and it preserves neighborhoods of points, and it preserves spatial binding, things like borders. If you've got a border between a border here, now you couldn't say there's a physical border, but there is a border between countries there. Or you can say there's a border between that purple of the flower and the white of the background, and there's a real border in the physical world. So the point about analog models is they need no decoding, or they need a lot less decoding than neurally encoded models. So that's the proposal, that an analog model in the brain is somehow responsible for consciousness. So the first question about that, oh, sorry, here's another slide, which I think I'll wait. Analog model is not a simple issue. The philosophers have walked around these many times and raised many complicated considerations, and you can talk a long time about them. But I'd rather not do that now. I'd rather come back to that slide if anybody asks a question about it. If people says analog models are not that simple, I agree, they're not that simple, and we can talk more about them. But the main issue here is, are analog models divisible? In other words, if you zoom in on a map, do you get down to marks of ink on paper, and are those marks encoded? The example I put against this is an optical image of a scene. That is not divisible. There's minimum resolution from the wavelength of light. So, and similarly, a hologram is not divisible. You can't keep on carving it up to ever finer and finer divisions. So analog models are not always divisible like symbolic representations are. So I'll skip over that for the moment, may come back to it. The important point here is that consciousness has spatial binding, like an analog model. Our conscious experience includes a 3D model of the space around us. That model has spatial binding. You have borders in your consciousness, and they're borders in conscious experience in the real world. So there's a nice correspondence there between consciousness and an analog model of space, because there'd been no need to decode an analog model to get consciousness. So that's the origin of the proposal. The brain, as well as a computer, holds an analog model of local space, and that analog model is the core source and the only source of consciousness. And neuron firing has really nothing directly to do with consciousness. So that's the proposal. Immediate questions about this proposal. What use is it, analog model? Is there any reason for it to have evolved? And I shall argue that it is a very useful thing, because if we have a Bayesian model of cognition, we want some integrated Bayesian maximum likelihood model of what is where in the space around the animal. We want that model to integrate all the sense data coming into the animal. And an analog model would be a great place to put that information. It's a great place to persist spatial information for short periods of a few seconds. It's also a useful resource for what the brain has to do is to classify things it sees into the types of things that require specific action. It's also a useful model for planning and simulating physical actions. And it's also useful for comparing what's going on now with previous situations in memory. So there are lots of uses for it. And I think there's a very good story for why it would have evolved if it's physically possible. Furthermore, I've argued in separate papers that there is a possible physical form for the model as a wave excitation in the thalamus, and you can see other papers by me about that. But that wave excitation in the thalamus is not the focus of this talk. It's merely what I'd call an existent proof that analog models in the brain are not stupid. They might exist, and they might be the source of consciousness. Now, I shall now talk about possible impact on the free energy principle. Here is a picture of the free energy principle and active inference as it stands today. The brain is a neural computer which encodes probabilities, Bayesian probabilities of events and things in the light of the animal sense data. So you have this cycle, which is an active inference cycle, that you have a neural computer brain. The neural spike trains in the brain get decoded into muscle actions which make the animal move, and that feeds back to changes in the external world, which produce sensory changes, which are then encoded back into the neural computer. And so you get that cycle of active inference. And what the brain here is doing is producing the maximum likelihood models of the world in an encoded form. Now, what I claim the first part of this paper, this talk implies, is that that model is not sufficient to give you consciousness, because the only decoding we have here, I say no decoding in this slide, actually we have some decoding here, but that decoding is purely from spike trains in the brain to muscle actions. And that's not the kind of decoding we need for consciousness. We need consciousness to decode information about the external world. So the claim here is that the FEP as it stands is not capable of accounting for consciousness. So what do we need to do? We add an analog model to it, and the analog model is the white area in the middle, an analog model of local space, a 3D model stored, I think, in a wave excitation, but that may not be the case. And then you have not only an outer Markov blanket between the brain and the world and the animal, you have an inner Markov blanket between the brain and the analog model. So the inner Markov model separates the brain from the analog model, and you have a lot more encoding and decoding going on. Sense data encodes, and that gets decoded back again into the analog model and encoded back again from the model into the neural computer. And the red box is a sensory cycle, which iteratively builds the best, most likely analog model from sense data. And there's another encoding and decoding set where there's a planning cycle. In other words, the animal tries out some future move, and what happens there is information is encoded from the analog model into the neural computer and is decoded back again. And that's an internal simulation facility, if you like, of trying out actions and seeing what happens. So in this extended FEP model, consciousness arises only from the analog model. And that acts, if you like, as a nucleus of the brain. So that I would propose as a possible way forward for the FEP if the FEP wants to account for consciousness. Right. So just a brief sideline on future theories of consciousness. Although I've said purely neural theories of consciousness can't work fully, some of them have so many promising elements in them. For instance, Barr's global workspace theory, you can interpret the global workspace as an analog model of space in a thalamocortical system. There's been a lot of work about consciousness without a cortex, and by Bjorn Merker, for instance, and there you could interpret this as midbrain structures, highly conserved, maybe the seat of consciousness. Particularly interesting is the PCM, the projective consciousness model, which is an outgrowth from the FEP by Rudraff and company in 2017 onwards. And there, in that model, there's a projective transform model of space in the brain. And I think a model of space is a very good start for the foundation of consciousness. And I've taken this a bit further, taking the projective consciousness model and putting it in a wave in the thalamus. And that, I believe, is a way forward. But again, it's not the main focus of this talk. So that was a bit of a sideline. So that, I think, is more or less the end of the formal talk. And I open it up for discussion.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Yeah, a round of applause as people are already dancing. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Fantastic. There have been already some thoughts in between. Are there some thoughts, comments, or questions for Robert now? Otherwise, yeah.
You're all convinced.
Alessandra, please, the stage is yours.
Hi. Sorry. Yeah, no, this was really, very, very interesting. So discussion about these questions. I guess I'll just like blaze through them really quick. I don't think there's an alternative in the brain, but I have been very taken by the idea that the brain is not, like, we should not identify with our brains, but rather with whatever this analog model is. And you do mention that there's sort of, the neurons have no role per se. But I do agree with it could be stored as maybe not so much a wave, but there's some nice, very niche electromagnetic theories of consciousness. So it would be maybe the entire field, and the sort of spatial relations are stored. It's hard to say stored because it's not about decoding, but they are represented, I guess.
Yeah, can I come in there? I think there's electromagnetic field theories. They are a step forward, but I don't think they're quite the right step forward.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. One is the electromagnetic field is purely a passive byproduct of neurons firing, really.
Right.
And so it's not a store of information. I think the evolutionary need is a short-term memory to hold the information as part of this iteration to find the most likely model. So that's one reason why I'm not keen on electromagnetic. The second reason is qualia. we experience lots of different colors, different sensations, and so on. And if you look at electromagnetic fields, sure, they can represent space, but they can't represent qualia at the same time because they've got too few degrees of freedom. Electromagnetic waves only got 2 degrees of freedom, just the polarization, basically, whereas we have dozens of different qualia. And so we need a fancier field that somehow has more degrees of freedom.
Agreed.
So that's a bit of truth, but that's why I'm not so keen on electromagnetism.
Yeah, I think that wouldn't necessarily disqualify them. We just have to sort of modify. I agree that the arguments for the EM theories are not satisfying. But funnily enough, the direction I was going is exactly like I wanted to call the paper "The Code is Not the Consciousness."
Right.
So
That's
that's
good.
I was like, oh, I need to join TNB today. But in terms of back to your what you're pressing against, I think that we can accept that the type of field that we have, it's not so much about it being a field, like you're saying, but that the sort of multiplexing that we're able to do with the oscillations in our particular field that is enabled by neuronal firing, and neuronal firing gives rise to those oscillations. So it wouldn't be a single wave, I guess. It would just be sort of, you get the qualitative texture from those oscillatory.
I think the problem with all these things is you can't afford almost any decoding. You've got to have something which is really like what it's like with no decoding.
Yes.
And that's hard.
So for me, the bullet that has been is just that we are not trying to decode those frequencies. And that's usually when you think of an electromagnetic signal, we need a decoder somewhere. But if that signal just is this analog model, then we don't need decoding. That's just it, basically.
I think it's kind of the buck stops here, really.
Yeah. So that's.
Thanks.
That's
great.
Thank you very much for this question, Alessandra. Do we have any more questions? Maybe also feel. Oh yeah, Stephen, please.
I'm not hearing anything.
I think you just muted yourself again. Oh, there might be something weird with the audio today. We're not hearing.
All right,
At least I'm not hearing. That? No, it works. It works. Yeah.
It's the first time I've used this platform. A couple of things completely in accordance with what you're saying, Robert. Thank you.
Right.
But I think perhaps I need to understand the terminology a little bit better. I think muscle activity is a decoding.
Yeah, I agree.
On actions on the world is a kind of decode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Secondly, why limit yourself to one internal Markov blanket? Why couldn't there be several, either hierarchical or in multiple arrangements?
Well, there obviously are lots of different Markov blankets. I claim the total outer one and the total inner one are the ones that matter. Now, why there's only one inner Markov blanket, there could have evolved several, but the fact is we only have one consciousness. So I want one Markov blanket to correspond to that.
All right, that's my final point. Do we have only one consciousness, or is it a constantly fluidly changing consciousness? And how does that relate to the Buddhist idea of awakening?
Deep question. I think we only have one consciousness. If you go back to Thomas Nagel's definition of what it is like, there is a unity about it, although it's very fluid and changing, and Buddhists certainly concentrate on the moment and so on, and the changing moment. There is one of it. And my consciousness of space around me is just, there is one space that's got all these things in it. So I think the unity of consciousness is a real fact that we have to try and make our theories fit.
All right, you're pointing to, and finally, I'll end with this, the internal map representation of the world in terms of the somatotopic or topographical mapping of all of the senses.
Yeah.
There's a retinotopic map, a somatotopic map.
Yeah, all that
these
stuff. Somewhere, all
analog.
that stuff has to get integrated together. And
Yes,
I'm saying the wave is, or the analog model is where it all gets integrated.
I see. All right. I mean, I will interpret what you're saying in that sense. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much for the question, Stephen. Do we have any more thoughts or comments or questions? Maybe we can also just briefly go back to the slide that you showed in the break, so to speak.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe that, because I have some thoughts about this. Maybe
that one?
Yeah, I think it was that one.
You can read it, can you? It's not full screen.
Yeah. But that doesn't matter. Yeah. Does anyone have some thoughts about this? Otherwise, I'll just very interesting presentation. A couple of things that came into my head. One that I would be curious to get your sort of perspectives on is whether you think, I mean, obviously the second point says consciousness contains information about the external world, but to what degree do you think that's exclusive? Does consciousness also contain information about sort of that are maybe non-spatial and entirely internal, such as where, for example, I would see emotions falling into,
Right.
and how do you think these would fit, especially with a spatial bounding model? And sorry, I just Nushi, I didn't see your hand before. I'll get to you in a second. Sorry.
That's a very good question.
I just raised my hand. Sorry.
Okay.
It's a very good question. In this theory, consciousness comes entirely from the analog model. And in some sense, consciousness is entirely spatial. There's nothing else. Now, I think that fits with the data in the following sense, that we have consciousness of things outside, we have consciousness of things we imagine, but we imagine spatial scenarios, we imagine what happens if I raise my hand or whatever it is. And we have consciousness of the words in our head, but they have a location somewhere vaguely in our head. And so verbal consciousness is compatible with the spatial model. And when we're conscious of emotions, that's a combination of some string of thought that says, oh my God, I'm in this situation, and some bodily feeling somewhere in your gut or your head or wherever it may be. So again, that can fit in, emotions can fit inside the spatial model. So in brief, I think that spatial prediction that there is only spatial consciousness is compatible with the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. So essentially, maybe something that is maybe even not inherently spatial, such as a feeling, for example, of love, would be bound spatially to a location, for example, in the body where it is felt. Is that essentially?
Yeah, love is a hard one.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Nushim, your question.
Yeah,
Questions.
thank you. So I'm kind of new in this topic, and sorry if I have some kind of gap in my knowledge, but I've been trying to go through all the literature about consciousness, and I wanted to know, based on what Christopher asked, what's the role of self in this spatial analog spatial model? And I wanted to know if temporality actually defines itself here, because I am as a self is trying to compare myself or kind of see how I can interact in this spatial model. So I wanted to know, it's kind of, I don't know how to ask my question, but this seems like a kind of continuous interaction between self and the environment, but in these analog models. And I wanted to know more about this, but I'm not sure if I asked my question properly.
Sorry, it's kind of difficult because your sound is not very clear, but I think, could you try and repeat briefly the core question? Because the sound
yes.
is not working very well.
Is it clear now? Sorry, my microphone
It's
is
better.
not working.
Yeah, shout at me.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So I wanted to know what is the relationship between self and this spatial model every person had created. Like, I know this is the spatial model I have created from my environment, and I wanted to know what is its relationship between self and the environment. And I wanted to know.
Okay.
Yes.
That's a very good question.
Yes. And I wanted to know if there's. Sorry.
If I can just address the question of self-consciousness, we have self-consciousness, but this theory says that not only are we conscious, but all sorts of animals are conscious, animals which have very little sense of themselves. I think the average monkey or the average rat just sees the world as a kind of cinema, that it's watching what happens and has no idea and no need to think about itself as an entity. So I think the issue of self-consciousness is a complicated one, but basically we don't have much evidence about what self-consciousness is other than a train of thought about ourselves. And that train of thought is words which we hear in our head as part of the spatial model. So that's where I think self-consciousness fits in. It's a kind of thing that came along with humans, but it's not the main part of the show.
I think kind of makes sense, but I also wanted to know, how does temporality play in this? How does temporality or time has a role in this here? I wanted to know how self and the environment keep interacting with each other and create this model. And I was thinking maybe there must be some more focus on temporality between self and the environment in this analog space model. I don't know if my sound is clear.
You're asking lots of complicated questions there. I can point you to papers I've written about aspects of, for instance, how the model is created by a kind of iteration between the model and sense data to produce the very most likely Bayesian model of all the space around an animal. But it is a complicated question. Unfortunately, I don't hear it very well either.
Thank you. I would pretty much like that if you could give me some suggestion about the articles I could read. I'm really interested in this topic.
Yeah, please send me an email and then I can reply with a few pointers.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you very much for these questions, Nushin. Alessandra, did you have another question, or did that one resolve?
Oh, yeah, it was kind of just the mention of feelings. Actually, just coincidentally, what sort of led us down this route is work on the human affectome, and thinking about the relations. I think sort of a second argument implicit in your talk, Robert, is potentially this what we're calling the soft problem, where it's that even if we were ever to specify the hard problem, it would be by not just identifying some single relation between physical and mental, but actually we need to this is touching on what people call the easy problem. But we need to account for all the relations, basically.
I can give you my prejudices about that. I don't have much time for the hard problem, because David Chambers very eloquently drew attention to this hard problem, division between consciousness and everything physical.
Yes.
And he said, if we have a theory of consciousness, eventually we'll get down to that hard problem which we can't solve. And I agree with him. But
Yeah.
any branch of science, like physics, you always get down to hard problems that you can't solve. Like physics, you get down to molecules, atoms, protons, quarks, etc. And you go down to a level you can't go any further. Or you go back to the origin of the universe, you can't go any further. So
Yeah.
to me, hard problems are quite common in science, and we kind of ignore them and get on with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this approach is sort of like, I agree that the hard problem has been almost distracting. But the one that we're more interested in is this question of relations, which you're
Yeah,
referring
absolutely.
to as spatial binding.
If you like, you put it, I could put it that I'm not worried about the existence of consciousness. I know that consciousness exists. What I'm worried about is the properties of consciousness,
Agreed.
what it's like.
So we're just calling this the soft problem because it seems to be about the texture of experience. And I think that, touching on what someone, I think maybe it was Koenig who mentioned, like feelings as having relations, there's some nice work that actually in the lab that I'm part of where abstract relations are encoded in theta waves originating from the hippocampus. So things like love and self-consciousness can definitely be captured in this view.
Yeah, the question is how we experience them. I mean, I think our conscious experience is feelings at definite places in the body. You feel something in your chest or whatever, or something in your forehead, which you interpret that as an emotion, but the raw thing is a feeling, and you have some words to add to that, but that's what emotions are somehow.
Yeah, I think they can be in the body, but they also can be these contextual analog patterns that reflect that in the body. So I mean, because they're like sort of coupled in a particular way. Sorry, I'm just spitballing here, but yeah, I think this is a really good direction.
Right. Okay.
I'll email you. I'd love to talk more.
Thank you very much for this question, Alessandra. Robert, by the way, is it okay if I share your email in the chat so people?
Oh,
can
absolutely, absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'll just do that real quick. And Nick, please, your question.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. And I share a lot of the skepticism around functionalist approaches to consciousness. I have two questions where I was a little bit unsure in your presentation, but you might have outlined them perfectly and I just didn't understand. The first one was, how does your approach of an analogous model within the brain, situated within the brain, circumvent the homunculus problem? That is, does the analogous model, is it actually able to stop this infinite regress of always thinking about the Markov blanket behind the Markov blanket, so to speak, where you get into the infinitesimal smaller?
Good question. I think of the analog model is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for consciousness to exist. I think the sufficient condition is a certain physical type of the analog model, which I go off into quantum states and so on. But basically, whatever the analog model is, that is where the buck stops. There's no infinite regress. That's the last thing before consciousness.
Okay.
And now that's maybe just hand-waving words, I don't know, but anyway.
No, that's amazing. If you would have a paper on that, I would be very interested.
Right, okay, well, email me.
The second, I will, thank you. The second question I had, and I don't know this particularly well, but it's sort of a more global skepticism that I have, is how certain are you in general, or do you think that what the brain is actually doing is performing computations? Or is that a representation of what is actually happening?
Well, I think computation, the idea of computation centrally depends on an external interpretation. There is an external interpretation of the brain that it's making Bayesian maximum likelihood computations. And that's the one I believe in. That I think is a correct interpretation of the brain, but it is our interpretation rather than physically what is actually happening in the brain. What's happening in the brain has evolved so that physically, so that it can be interpreted as maximum likelihood, maximum fitness computation of choice of actions. So I basically believe computation is not just a physical process, it's always an interpretation. And we as scientists are interpreting the brain as a Bayesian machine, and that's a correct interpretation.
Okay. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nick, for these questions. Do we have any more questions at the moment? Otherwise, I'll just, I have a question as well. The general premise that sort of information itself is meaningless, I find very, very interesting, and I guess also resonates quite well with the Zen idea we had 2 weeks back in the talk. And I guess the point 5 in this slide, the decoding information is not in the brain, is deducted logically from what you mentioned, that sort of a computer cannot decode itself, by the example, for example, of a book or computer, an abacus. But I just wonder whether it's truly necessary that it is an external computer, or whether it is necessary that it is always a human. Because if we were, for example, thinking that one computer would be listening or whatever to another computer and decoding it, I think we would sort of semantically or logically arrive at the same meaninglessness that, for example, you referred to when talking about an abacus. That's just information itself, but it is not being given meaning because there's no subjective interpretation, which is, as I would understand, always coming from a human interpreter. I'm not sure whether I'm making sense in the.
No, there's a couple of interesting questions in there. Firstly, can the brain decode itself? In other words, there are higher order theories of consciousness that says there's a basic cognitive process going on, computing about the world, and there's a higher order computation which is aware of its own computations. And can the higher order computer decode the lower order computer? Well, the answer is yes, it can, but then the higher order computer itself is encoded. So you get an infinite regress that way. So you can't have one computer watching another computer, because the two of them are just one big box of electronics or neurons. So you can't get out of that. But you can have a non-human interpreter, in that before humans existed, animals had Bayesian brains, and their computers were interpreted by muscles which had actions on the world. And that's what the interpretation was, and that's what designed brains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so essentially I would, very interesting points. What I would mean is essentially, yeah, like biological computer. So be it an animal or be it a human or computer. But I guess that also, and I think it's always super, like one of the most difficult points about consciousness, and the field is always one also about definition, because I think that makes a problem more tractable in the realm of consciousness. I'm no expert, but sometimes it can be difficult to define varying terms. But I would, for example, also about the point that you made, that sort of higher order consciousness theories, whether a brain can decode itself. And it might be a question about definition here, what decoding means. But for me, intuitively, one on a horizontal level, at the same level, essentially, one neuron needs to be able at least to work in the same realm of understanding. One might call this decoding, to be able to work with input from another neuron. Same
Absolutely,
as sort of hierarchies. And like the higher level needs to be able to decode and decoding again here might be sort of defined in different ways, but I would just somewhat ignorantly call it that, needs to be able to, for example, interpret the precision-weighted prediction error from the lower level to be able to update its model. And there might be, I guess this process is sort of driven by internal priors, precision-weighted prediction errors, structural plasticity, which is learned from experience. And that process I would consider internal sense making. But I guess so I'm not sure how you think about that, whether it's more about definitions or
Well, the way I think about it is that neurons in different parts of the brain have to agree on a code so that one can transmit information to another, but it's all encoded. And the kind of decoded information that we have in consciousness just doesn't appear in neurons. It's all highly encoded because consciousness is fundamentally very spatial. It's 3D, and neurons firing is just patterns in time. So there's got to be a huge amount of encoding and decoding between those two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess there would be the question sort of where this encoding and decoding is happening. I'm not sure I can make sort of more substantial claims about that, but I think also very interesting towards what you said, and I'm sure sort of you've encountered sort of the idea of cognitive maps by Tolman and O'Keefe and Nadel and Behrens more recently, sort of spatial navigation, which isn't necessarily, and again, this won't be a definition question, an analog spatial map, because analog might be, and I'm not the best to make a definition
I agree
here.
with you. Yeah,
but still the very interesting overlaps.
Mm-hmm. There are overlaps. There are plenty of maps in the brain, but I believe they're all encoded. They're all firing rate stuff. And the fact that V1 visual cortex has a spatial resemblance to the visual field is just an evolutionary convenience. What matters about those neurons is their connectivity structure, and that's a graph topology, and it's got not much to do with space. You could spatially move those neurons around the place as long as you kept the synaptic connections the same, and they'd still do the same job.
Yeah, that very, very interesting. Do we have some more questions, thoughts, or comments for now? Otherwise, I believe it is your turn now, Carl.
So it's my turn now, is it?
I think so.
Thank you very much. Yeah, well, you haven't left me very much to talk about, have you? So that's good and bad. So I'll just focus on the discussion and the presentation from the point of view of the free energy principle, and then just point to a couple of bits of work that I think would be interesting to join the dots between what we've been talking about and related perspectives that have different kinds of commitments, but the same underlying theme. I think Christoph identified the key thing, which is the semantics of what people mean by encoding and decoding, because I was quite comfortable with the denouement of the presentation when it ended up with an inner screen, implying that the brain is indeed a special computer that can decode itself. And this resolves everything. And I was quite happy with that. And indeed, the first paper that I've got to share with people is Chris Field's inner screen hypothesis, which reaches exactly the same conclusion, that you have to have this irreducible inner screen that resolves the infinite regress that basically allows the brain to decode itself. And interestingly, in that particular formulation, or the version of the paper that was pre-printed, the decoding aspect, as I'm currently reading it, was the inner screen, the irreducible inner screen, was actually acting upon hierarchical layers or Markov blankets outside of itself. and that action was not in terms of movement, but in terms of deploying attention, so mental action, by greasing certain pathways, for example. So a slight generalization of the notion of decoding, possibly. But anyway, I was quite happy with that, and it did strike me that the final challenge in terms of, should the free energy principle want to explain consciousness, then it would need this kind of generalization. I have to say that the free energy principle is not a theory of consciousness, but you could certainly deploy it, or you could apply it in an attempt to explain consciousness. But in and of itself, it's just a principle of least action.
Can I come in briefly, Carl?
Yeah.
Just very briefly. The emphasis of this talk has been not so much to what can we have as a theory of consciousness, but to say there is consciousness, there is evidence. What does it tell us about how the brain works? And I think the free energy principle, being about how the brain works, needs to pay attention to that evidence. And so that's why I think we're forced to have an inner screen or inner Markov blanket.
Yes. Yes, should you want to apply the free energy principle to to brains that have the attribute of consciousness, absolutely. I have to say the free energy principle is not about brains; it's about anything that possesses a Markov blanket. So it would apply to non-conscious things in the sense that you're talking about. And I think in that spirit, if you're talking about generalization, a particular kind of system, or a particular natural kind that does analog computation, would have the following necessary attributes in order to at least support the possibility of consciousness. And I agree entirely. I think the screen is one very neat way of describing that. You could also say that for example, only multicellular organisms could possibly have consciousness. A single cell can't be consciousness because it doesn't have that sort of nested embedding of Markov blankets, nor is there a clearly identifiable, irreducible Markov blanket on the inside that would license you, because you talked explicitly about the outer Markov blanket and the inner one. And I read that as saying, well, now we have the opportunity for this biological computer now to decode itself in exactly the way that
I think that's a good way of putting it, actually. Yeah.
So, and that would be, I think, important, because the people like, say, Mike Levin, who sort of, I think in a good-hearted and I think very defendable way, talk about basal cognition that can be applied to single cells or even organelles, but there could be a pushback against that. If you don't have a multicellular organism with the right kind of hierarchical structure that allows for something on the inside to decode something that's on the inside but outside to the thing that's doing the decoding, then you couldn't have that. You couldn't have basal consciousness. You could possibly have basal cognition, but not basal consciousness. I think it's an important issue. The other thing which occurred to me was, of course, that the free energy principle actually starts with dynamics. It starts with the analog universe. It starts with the Langevin equation. So all the computation is analog computation. It's just, as you say, what does it look like and how could it be described in terms of Bayesian belief updating. But even in that, under that interpretation, it's all analog computing. And I think that's important to say, because it harps back to very simple-minded but endemic debates that I remember people like Jerry Edelman having, saying that you cannot apply the arguments that you would find, say, in Gödel's theorem, or the arguments about computability in Turing machines, or algorithmic complexity and Sonoff induction. These things just don't apply to real physical systems, because real physical systems are, by construction, analog computers. They have dynamics. So
I suppose that the difference I would point to there is that the analog, as you use the word, is in a very multidimensional space, abstract space. And what I need is something in a physical, something that maps onto 3D physical space.
Yeah, but I think if you were talking with people like Mike Levin now, or possibly Chris Fields, yeah, you're making a big leap of faith here. Most of these analog interpretations are sort of background free. They are space-time free. In fact, that's not quite true. They are space free. So space becomes an emergent property of the decoding. It becomes an emergent property of a more primal or minimal kind of analog computation. That's where we depart. You've got your, if you like, your commitments and the sort of 3D model that says that all consciousness necessarily sits within some kind of metric space, and that this is and nicely exemplified by the thalamic wave and sort of Bose-Einstein condensates, for example. What I'm saying is you don't have to have that particular commitment to actually commit to, yes, it's all analog, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And it has to be. And under that, if you like, perspective, what then can we say about the nature of decoding? And that's basically where I wanted to sort of press you on. So just to come back to the sort of the fundamental semantics of coding and decoding. Because well, before I do that, can I just quickly show the 3 papers just for the recording, and then I'll come back to a conversation with you about what you mean by decoding and encoding. Let me just do the screen share.
Can I stop sharing?
I think I've automatically taken over.
You grabbed it.
Have I? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. So just what I So for those people who are not in the audience who are not familiar with the particular version of the inner screen hypothesis, this was the version I was referring to. The first author on the rewrite of this, which is now being published by the Neuroscience of Consciousness, is actually Chris Fields, and that's basically his formulation of this inner screen. But I thought it was particularly interesting because one of the graphics, which you will only find in this paper, does actually emphasize the importance of decoding or action, covert action, from within inner or internal Markov blankets. And I was wondering whether that could be read as the kind of decoding that we saw at the end of Robert's presentation. Just in relation to literally relational quantum mechanics and metric spaces, I think you'd enjoy actually sort of developing argumentatively the motivation for a analog of metric spaces from the point of view of relational quantum mechanics. I personally wouldn't go there. I'm personally quite happy with working with statistical manifolds that already have all the necessary information geometry because they are equipped with the right kind of metric, which for me is a Fisher information metric. But you like spatial metrics, and that immediately speaks to frames of reference and metric frames of reference, and how one thing stands metrically in relation to something else. So I'd be interested to hear you debate with Rovelli or people who debate him the importance of these sort of equipping these analog models, or any generative model, including the projective consciousness model, with the attribute that they have to they are equipped with some with a proper metric above and beyond the information metric. I think it's an interesting, and there may be answers in relational quantum mechanics. But one thing which I thought you might enjoy was this. Izzy Stoll sent me this about 2 days ago. Well, me and about 50 other people, if not 100 other people. She's obviously very pleased with herself. She gives a 20-minute lecture where she is proposing that qualitative experience, or qualia, arise as a special consequence of analog neuronal computation that supports projections onto membranes in the spirit of a holographic screen. And so I did notice you were sort of using Fourier transforms and holographic, not the holographic principle, but sort of holographic transformations. This is at a much smaller scale than you. She's talking about the microscopic, but what she's saying is that if you look at the thermodynamics of ion transport on a single cell, there's something quite unique about brain cells that allows for the electrochemical gradients to establish a holographic representation spatially on the surface of these cells, which you can't find on plants, for example, and you won't find on muscles, but you do find them in nerve cells. So I thought you might like that. I don't know how widely accepted it is, but that's well, that's a link there. YouTube. Oh well.
YouTube.
Carl, can I mention something really quick?
Yes, of course.
I was there in person, so I met Izzy right after her talk.
Oh, lovely.
And the conversation that I was having with her that is similar to the one that we're having here is that that's exactly right. She's like focused on the microscopic sort of hologram, but I mentioned the idea of like cross-frequency coupling that would be possible even plants, but she's very focused on the fact that that you would have the fact that you have sort of this ionic porosity on a single cell allows you to have the hologram for that particular cell. But I think what's missing that she seemed really excited about is that as those things accumulate across many cells in the sense of these sort of local field potentials, that the hologram can be this broader thing across, at least in the case of multicellular creatures.
Right, I was trying to illustrate your narrative there with the slide that I remember. So here's a big hologram. Oh, yeah, go away. Yes, thank you.
Another hologram.
Another one comes along, yes. So let me stop sharing now.
Great, many thanks, Carl. I'm certainly looking into those papers.
Yeah, well, I think Izzy's stuff is just at the moment. I don't know that she's actually written it up, but certainly she enjoyed talking about it. And you might be able to pick up something which resonates with with this commitment to an actual physical and possibly not necessarily well. You watch and see what you think. See what you think. Whether you can find those Einstein condensate somewhere lurking in a holographic projections. So I just wanted to come back to this notion of encoding and decoding. It did seem to me that a lot of the analysis did rest very sensitively on the notion of decoding and encoding. And furthermore, your use of the word interpretation, you were saying I could replace it with decoding. I always replace measurement, observation, interpretation as inference. And inference is not really about decoding, or is it? So what I need to ask you, and it's not just you, I've seen a lot of confusion around in theoretical, specifically in computational neuroscience, where people talk about the neural code, and you have encoding and decoding models. And what that literature misses is that they've only got a three-way partition of all things. They've got a partition, in fact, it's a two-way partition. They've just got the thing that is being the data, the thing that is being represented, and the neuronal response. And the mapping from the data to the neuronal response is what? Is that the encoding or the decoding?
That's the encoding, I think.
Okay, and then the decoding is projecting from the neuronal response back to observable space, say in the form of action or reflexes or something that is actually.
I think there can be several decoding. I think the one we need for consciousness is decoding neuron firing patterns to spatial distributions.
Right. So that gets close to what my basic question is. The reason I find this literature extremely confusing, and the terminology in terms of neural codes and decoding and encoding, is it misses the point that there are no external states that are being encoded or decoded. So they assume when they're talking about this, it is sufficient just to understand the morphism or the map between the data and its representations, the sensorium and the neuronal response, and that's an encoding decoding relationship. That's not what the free energy principle says, and it's not what the physics of measurement says. The physics of measurement say that there is some external state of affairs that is generating the data, and then those data are then assimilated to make an inference, to form a belief about the cause.
Part of this is to say that the decoding is not the inverse of the encoding. In other words, what is encoded is sources of sense data, and the decoding goes to a spatial model of the sources of the sense data.
Do you mean by sources? Do you mean hidden sources or causes, or do you mean the actual sense data from, say, the retina?
The sources, the things out in the world that the photons came from.
Right. I think that needs clarifying then, both in terms of the graphic that you showed, but also in the various write-ups of this, because in machine learning and this kind of and it's usually attributed to people like Jeff Beck and Pouget and Ma and the like. This notion of encoding and decoding, that's it. That's not sufficient to talk about sort of the Bayesian brain, because you've got to distinguish between the cause, the source of something generating data, the data, and then how that is mapped to the inside of the brain. So now the neuronal response now has information about the source. The data is not the source. The data is some very small. So in encoding and decoding, in a variational autoencoder, in fact, what you have is the data comes in, say an image, it's then encoded into later representations, the causes, and then it's decoded through a bottleneck architecture back into image space again. So is that the kind of encoding, decoding mapping that we're talking about here?
Not quite, because that sounds as though the decoding is more like an inverse of the encoding.
Yeah, well, it is, yeah.
I think if you first start with the FEP without an inner Markov blanket, sense data is encoded, and then sense data is used to infer a maximum likelihood model of the state of the world, and that's used to choose actions. But that is an encoded maximum likelihood model of the state of the world. So what I'm talking about is taking that model, or rather having a brain where the maximum likelihood of the state of the world is in a spatially decoded form. And that serves as a short-term memory for what the animal thinks the state of the world is. So encoding goes from direction of incoming photons to spike trains, and decoding goes from spike trains to a 3D model of space.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite subtle. I think that needs to be unpacked. For people like, should you want to, for people like me, because personally, I never use the encoding or decoding word. I never needed to, because I find it confusing. But I think you're using decoding in a very special sense here. So I think it'd be useful to go back to the active inference cycle and just have sources out there, external states of the world. That could be me. It could be me with my multicellular organization, my hierarchical organization that I put inside my generative model. So now my generative model has inner screens because it's now a good model of hierarchical me. But what I would really like to know is, I can write down, and we use every day in terms of variational message passing or belief updating, the morphisms, the mappings. So all I need to know is, what do you mean by decoding and encoding? Is it a mapping from an unobservable source or a latent source of data to the data? Is it a mapping from the data to the internal representation? Is it a mapping from the internal representation back to the active states, which of course are ignored largely in sort of 20th century formulations, but that becomes important when the active states couple back and become causes of the sensory states. And I think you were using decoding, in a sense, more to also subsume the action that ensues, because actions are not random variables. So the actions in and of themselves are real variables. They're part of the, like the sensory data. They're not hidden, but they're not inferred. They're actually sort of real variables that someone could observe, and then they could interpret this as Bayesian inference, if you want. The point being here, though, that to come back where we started, your argument is, in fact, the brain is itself inferring its actions. And of course, that's one of the cornerstones of active inference, where you have planning as inference rests upon my beliefs about my actions are not my actions.
No,
because I got so big. There's a, but anyway, so I'd appreciate it. Well, there's a moment I'm getting too old now, but I think Christoph would appreciate just a more precise specification of what is meant by encoding and decoding in terms of the morphisms or maps between the partition into external, internal, sensory and active states.
I think mappings is a good word, that they're all mappings of one kind or another. And the thing I'm particularly calling decoding is a mapping from whatever it is, neural activity or whatever, to a 3D model of space.
So it's a model, so it's now an encoded representation of the space out there.
Well, it's a model with minimal encoding. The only encoding of it is a Fourier transform. There is some encoding via a Fourier transform, but a Fourier transform, it seems to me, is sort of basic in physics and quantum mechanics, and you can specify a Fourier transform without providing a load of decoding information. You can specify it by sort of one number, which says the scale here.
I fully appreciate that, and that's the beauty of well, you could argue that's the beauty of quantum mechanics, is just applying Fourier transforms to probability distributions.
Right.
And but from the sort of technical point of view, the Fourier transform is a map; it's a projection.
Technically, it is. The key thing is it doesn't require much decoding information. It doesn't require a decryption key to do it.
I see. So there's an implication these mappings are into smaller or larger spaces that require some aligned frame of reference, or to put it in ways. Yeah. Okay. Well, that will be useful to specify explicitly, because and it goes right back to Ashby's law of acquisite variety. How many degrees of freedom does your model need to control this world? Well, it needs as many, and that tells you immediately about the dimensionality of encoding and decoding. And of course, applying encoding and decoding to variational autoencoders, in fact, any bottleneck architecture, machine learning or statistics, is all about getting a high dimensional space through the bottleneck, which is a low dimensional space, back out again into a high dimensional space. It's all about perhaps encoding and decoding. Then it's not just simply specifying the particular domain and range of the mappings in question, but it comes along with implications or bounds on the dimensionality of the domain and the range of the domain and codomain.
Gosh, you're touching on lots here.
Well, you started it.
Yes.
So I'm being flippant. I'll hand back to Christoph now. I think we've all worn ourselves out with.
Perfect. So, have we, after all the complexity, sort of found this as an endpoint, at least for now? Or are there any more comments we want to make?
I think this is a never-ending story, so
Okay.
I'm happy for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Then
Oh, truth.
another big round of applause for you, Robert, for the fantastic presentation and tackling this endlessly complex topic. Thanks a lot for everyone for being here and the participation and the questions. I thought that was very insightful. And of course, thank you, Carl, for the discussion in the end. Yeah, I think that's a wrap up of the session today. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I hope you